We've already seen a little bit about the kind of cool stuff that we can do with floats, but I have to say that for people coming to floats for the first time, it can be one of the most hair-pulling experiences. So let's have a look at one or two of the problems with floats and how we can solve them. So going back to a previous example, what I've done is I've created a simple XHTML file, and once again I've got a content div which is wrapping two other divs which I'm going to style as columns. So simple stuff. Let's have a look in the browser. So we'll save that file, do a preview. And there's really not a lot to write home about. So let's go back into Dreamweaver and start to add some style. First things first, the body. I'm not going to explain each one of these examples until we get into some problems, because we can refer back to a previous example. So we'll style the body, the content div. We'll style the main content and the sub-content. And now add some floats. So on the content main, once again, we'll set a float. This time we'll float it left. We're not having to change the source order at all, just to change which side that column sits on. So we're going to say that that is float left. This time I'm going to give it a width of 240. And we'll do a similar thing with the content sub. This time we're going to float it right, make it 540. So let's have a refresh in the browser. We're roughly back to where we were before. I might at this stage just tidy up those paragraphs. And lovely jubbly, all seems to work very nicely. The problem is, though, is that if I want to add a colour, which is common to the surrounding wrapper, I'm going to drag over here some background colour. So I've got a darker purple background, which I want to enclose around each of those floated columns. Let's save that back into the browser and refresh, and nothing happens. Which isn't a problem, as long as we understand the specifications. The W3C specs say that a container should collapse when it contains floated elements, because essentially the floated elements are taking out of the flow. Now, this isn't a problem when you view the page in Internet Explorer, which looks visually correct, but actually gets the specs wrong in browsers up until version 6. So, although Internet Explorer looks like it's doing the right thing, in fact it's getting the specs wrong. And all the other browsers, which look wrong, are actually implementing the specs in exactly the right way. So luckily, there are some things that we can do to fix that. What we really need to do after these two floated columns is to clear the floats to allow the container to completely enclose its two floated columns. There's a number of different ways that we can do this. Some of the early ways included adding a break just before the closing tag of the wrapper, and a style, we've had it here, BR with a class of clear, and now a style where we can say clear both. And this is essentially forcing the wrapper to surround the content. So if we save that, flick over into Firefox and refresh, we can now see the effect that we actually want. Now, some people prefer to use another division or another div instead of a break. So here we have div with a class of clear. But to me, a break makes more sense, even though it's not ideal, than a division, which is, in my mind, supposed to include some content, which this one plainly doesn't. So let's have a look at that and see whether it has the same effect. Woohoo, which it does. So my personal view is that it's always rather irksome to have to add any additional markup into a document just to allow for a certain presentational look. After all, that's the whole idea of using CSS, is to get away from adding presentational elements or presentational markup into the document. But it's one of those situations which may be necessary when we want to start clearing floats. Now, some clever people have come up with a lot of different ways in which we can clear floats without having to use any structural markup or any additional markup in the document. Some people have used JavaScript, some people have used some more advanced CSS techniques such as generated content. And quite recently, a new technique appeared which left a lot of the design community slapping their foreheads thinking, why wasn't it me that thought of that? And that's to use the overflow property on the content div. So if I just remove some of these unnecessary styles, I'm just going to save the file and get back to where we were. So over into Firefox, and now we're not seeing what we want to see, even though Firefox is behaving perfectly correctly. It's very simple. If we come up to the content div and add overflow auto. What this essentially does is to make the browser sit up and go, oh, if you're talking about overflowing something, then I must need to wrap around something. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So if we have a look at that now in the browser, we'll see that without any structural markup, without any extra divs or breaks, we get the effect that we want. So lots of hair pulling commonly associated with using floats. But when we start to understand their behaviours properly, we can start to create some very, very interesting layout techniques. And we're going to conclude this chapter by bringing all these elements together into a complete multi-column layout with a header and footer.